Hi, Emily.
Hi. How's it going? Can you hear me okay? Sam, can you hear me? Oh, I can't hear you now. Why can't I hear you?
It's a little low, but I think it might be the volume of my computer.
Here, is this better? Now you're on my headset. Okay, cool. I don't know. It's I don't really like this headset, but I'm having some issues with my speaker and I can't actually hear unless I use this headset. So I'm just gonna go with it. But I know I've heard it's like a little bit intense on the other end. So is there anything I can do with the sound on my end to make it less like intense for you?
I don't think so. I mean,
Not that intense.
Okay.
Yeah, just hear you clearly, which is kind of nice.
I know it's a little too clear. Like I was trying to eat an apple before and it was like, they're like, please mute. So. So Sam, you're gonna do like before we kind of get moving, maybe you'll start talking and then we'll like turn all of our cameras on after that.
Yeah, so I'll just give a little intro to the Food Waste Fair, and then I'll just throw it over to you.
Okay.
I think Priyanka sent me a Hellmann's video she wanted me to share. And I have this graphic that I'm currently sharing. There's also some music that I will be playing, but I've listened to it on repeat a few times now and it drove me a little crazy. So I'll wait.
Okay.
I'll wait until like about, 5 minutes before to start it.
Also, Yvette, you have a slide of the action plan, right? That maybe you could.
Yeah, I realized this morning I like never sent it. So sorry. But Sam, would it make sense for you to share it? Okay, let me just forward it to you. Okay. And then also, Sam, maybe I can send this directly to you so it doesn't like appear in the chat. But here, I just sent you the link to the food waste action plan in case you want to like drop it in at some point. And then
So Yvette, do you want to show the slide not in your intro, but then when the first question I ask you, or do you want to show, because that's when you're going to go through like the different topics?
Yeah, I actually think that showing it like when you ask about the specifics would be better because it's more, it actually like lists out the points.
I agree. Okay, that sounds good. So we'll just tell Sam when to show it and then Sam can do that, right, Sam? Okay. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Oh, good. How are you?
Good.
I think.
All right, it's 12 o'clock. Hi, everybody. So I would like to welcome everyone to the third biennial Food Waste Fair. This is our first panel, and we're going to kick it off by having these stakeholders come together and tell you a bit about how they're thinking about setting and reaching national targets on food loss and waste. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind folks that we have a Q&A function, and I will be monitoring the chat, the Q&A function. And so if you guys submit questions, I'll be sending it over to Emily, who will be moderating this panel. And if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and just let me know, and I will throw it over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Sam, and thanks to the organizers of the New York City Food Waste Fair. I'm so glad to be here and to be moderating this panel of all-stars. I will note we are down one panelist. Dana Gunders from Refed is unfortunately not able to join, but we have a good plan in place to cover all of the content, and we have so much to discuss today. I'm Emily Leib. I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School and get to work with these amazing women all the time, which makes me very lucky. So I'm just going to give a really quick intro to what we'll talk about today, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists and get it started. As Sam mentioned, if you have questions throughout, you can put them into the Q&A, and we will definitely have time to answer as many of those questions as we can. So although there's an abundance of food produced in the US every year, a significant amount of this food is lost across the supply chain, as you all know, which is why we're here for this fair this week. But in recent years, public awareness of the issue has increased, and consumers and businesses have really sought to address this problem. In 2015, Champions 12.3 launched as an international coalition of private and public sector executives to work towards the Sustainable Development Goal, Target 12.3, which is reducing the loss and waste of food. In the US, retail, manufacturing, and food service sectors formed the Food Waste Reduction Alliance. And the federal government has also started to mount a response. In 2015, USDA and EPA announced the nation's first ever food waste reduction goal. Since 2015, Congress has taken an interest in this, holding the first ever House Agriculture Committee hearing on food waste in 2016, and including food waste for the first time in the US Farm Bill in 2018. And in 2019, EPA, USDA, and FDA announced a kind of coordinated strategy across agencies to address food loss and waste. States have also taken interest in this, and we've been tracking state legislation, which has increased in all of the last 3 legislative sessions across the country. So policy plays a really important role in the decisions that businesses make, that consumers make. It can be a way that we're driving and aligning incentives and making it easier to recover and rescue and donate food. It can sometimes stand in the way of good ideas if there are unclear laws on food safety or incentives that don't really align with innovation and with investment in this realm. So because policy is such a vital consideration, we're going to spend this panel today really talking about this. We're going to focus at the federal level and talk about what agencies can do and are doing and what Congress is doing, why industry is getting involved and really pushing for better policies. And we'll talk a little bit as well about how this interrelates with what's going on at the state and local level. So the panelists for today, we have Yvette Cabrera, who's Director of Food Waste at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Claudia Fabiano, who's an environmental protection specialist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Priyanka Malhotra, who is senior brand manager at Unilever Hellmann's Best Foods. And I'm going to actually ask each of them a lead-in question for them to get to introduce themselves and their organization, and then get us into some of the meat of the conversation. So Yvette, I'm going to ask you to go first. NRDC has been involved in food waste reduction for years and in various projects and research. Most recently, NRDC was one of several organizations, my own organization included, that led the drafting of a U.S. food loss and waste action plan. It would be great if you could tell us a little more about what NRDC has been doing in this space and then kind of how this action plan came together and how it works.
Absolutely. Thanks, Emily. And just a quick thank you to the Sanitation Foundation for putting on this food waste fair. I myself have been to multiple and they're so fun and such a great learning opportunity. So thank you. Great. So yes, NRDC has been working on food waste for many years. It was actually, our work was kickstarted by Dana Gunder's Wasted Report that she launched when she was at NRDC. And since then, as you mentioned, NRDC has worked on food waste in various ways. We conduct intensive research, for example, to better understand food waste generation and the potential for increased food rescue across different sectors like restaurants and grocery stores, and also in different geographies. We work on consumer awareness and behavior change through research and with our campaign called Save the Food, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And through our project called Food Matters, we partner with city governments and local organizations in cities to achieve meaningful reductions in food waste through comprehensive policies and programs. And we also, as you mentioned, work to advance state and federal policy around food waste. Our organizations, NRDC, ReFed, Harvard, and World Wildlife Fund joined forces to draft and release the U.S. Food Loss and Waste Action Plan earlier this year in April. And for those of you that are not yet familiar with the plan calls on the Biden-Harris administration and Congress to take ambitious action to achieve our national goal to reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030 through 5 key action areas. The 5 key actions include investing in prevention and keeping food waste out of landfills, better enabling surplus food donation, demonstrating US leadership on food waste at home and abroad, educating and activating consumers, and standardizing date labels. And I think we're going to drop the link into the chat so you all can check out the website of the Food Loss and Waste Action Plan for more detail. And here on the slide, you can see the action areas outlined, but we'll dive into those a little bit deeper in a bit. But now this is the first time our organizations have come together with a unified voice on how the federal government can address food waste. And we felt like it was the right time to do this for a couple of reasons. First off, we all know that we're in the midst of a climate crisis, and food waste in the US is responsible for about 4% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's more than the US airline industry. So it's a big chunk of the pie here. And while 30 to 40% of food in the US isn't eaten, millions face hunger. And this issue was exacerbated as the COVID pandemic created massive disruptions in the food system, and so many lost their sources of income. And our new administration has been vocal and proactive on climate change, food insecurity, and equity. And we wanted to leverage this to drum up action on food waste. In 2015, the US adopted a national goal of having food loss and waste by 2030. And while there have been enormous strides to achieve this goal by businesses, government agencies, funders, we need a massive acceleration if we actually want to achieve it. And because food waste occurs at every stage of the food supply chain, including in businesses and homes, the strategies to reduce food waste must come from all sectors and all regions, supported by federal funding, real leadership, and a strong directive for action. So if you take a look on the website, you'll see we have a robust list of supporters, including city governments, major corporations, local nonprofits, funders, and the list is growing. These are all, oh, sorry about that. So sorry, this is what having a dog is like and working from home. 1 second. Okay, it might get a little bit better. So sorry, you can hear it in the background. But our list of supporters is growing. And all the supporters that are on this list are organizations that are doing great work. But they all know that if we want to achieve our goal, we need to work together. We need to have a unified voice, and we need coordinated action by federal government that can really kind of bring us together and support the change that we'd all like to see. And so federal action on food waste is essential to building a regenerative and resilient food system that helps mitigate climate change, reverses nature loss, and feeds more people. And that's why we released this action plan. And we've been excited to see how much interest and support we've received. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's great. And we'll get back to go in a little more detail on some of the topics there. Claudia, I'm going to ask you to jump in next. And as was mentioned, EPA, along with USDA, announced the first ever national food waste reduction goal in 2015, which was to halve food waste by 2030. It would be great if you could talk about how and why that goal was set, and then what targets EPA has for meeting it, and just what you're most excited or proud of in terms of EPA's work towards reaching this goal.
Sure. Thanks, Emily, for moderating this panel. And thanks again to the Sanitation Foundation for putting this fair together, and to my fellow panelists as well. Yeah, I'm Claudia Fabiano, and I work in the Sustainable Management of Food team in EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery. And as has been mentioned, I'm sure you all are aware that in 2015, EPA, along with USDA, announced the national goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50%, around the same time that the International Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3 was adopted by world leaders. At that time, we really built upon work we've been doing for several years to bring attention to the issue, and we wanted to jumpstart action by setting a national goal. And I would say that since then, we've seen so many stakeholders, from individual businesses and companies to states and cities, adopt similar goals of their own and really start to dedicate resources to tackling the issue. So you asked about a few things that I could talk about that EPA has done since the goal was announced. I think we've really worked to help build some national and local networks of private and public sector stakeholders. An example would be how we established, along with USDA, the 2030 Champions Group, which are businesses who have publicly committed to the 2030 goal, as well as greatly expanding the number of communities in our national Food Too Good to Waste peer network, which are communities and municipal and state governments that focus on household food waste reduction efforts. We've also greatly improved our federal interagency coordination with USDA and bringing FDA into the fold, including the development and implementation of our interagency strategy on food waste, which I'll talk a little bit in more detail later. I would say one of our big roles at EPA is to provide technical assistance and funding, which we've been able to do through national tools such as the Access Food Opportunities Map and with regional and national funding opportunities. As an example, we've invested $3 million so far toward anaerobic digestion, with another $2 million expected next year. Another big focus over the past few years has been improving our estimation of food waste nationally. We overhauled our national methodology to provide more granular data, and we've also worked to fill a data gap by collecting food waste processing data directly from anaerobic digestion facilities to really provide a more national look at capacity operations and biogas production and more. We've also worked internationally, for example, with Mexico and Canada over the last several years through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, providing practical tools and supporting pilot projects aimed at using measurement of food waste to propel action. And we've also done some work in North America through the same group with focusing on youth. We've put out a youth toolkit full of hands-on activities and piloted that throughout North America as well. So those are just a few examples of some things EPA has been focusing on in the last few years.
It's amazing, and you've been such good partners, I can say from experience. Okay, Priyanka, so, from the perspective, Hellmann's has been taking real leadership in food waste and in policy as well. What are some of the goals in this area of Hellmann's, and what are you doing to achieve those goals?
Awesome. Thank you, Emily, for having me here, and for the sanitation department as well. So, when we looked at the entire food system, we found that food waste is one of those issues, and as all of you have said, that can really have an impact on climate change and on food insecurity. So, we started researching that space, and with your help and with Dana's help on ReFed, we found that 40% of food is wasted at home. And that's sort of what triggered us to think about what we can do and the responsibility we have as such a big brand, because we have so many people who use us and love us. We must, reach out to them and sort of empower each and every individual to make a difference in food waste. And that's really where we decided that our goal is a little bit different from what we've been talking about here. What we are doing is we are very focused on inspiring and enabling people to be resourceful with their food. So a couple of things we're doing is we have a TV campaign live right now, which is all around make taste, not waste. So you open your refrigerator, you open the pantry, and you find some ingredients in there. You don't know what to do. If you engage with Hellmann's, we will, sort of work with you to utilize those ingredients so that you don't waste that food. So that's just sort of one of the aspects of work we're doing, which is consumer education. The other piece which you hinted on, which is policy. So we are working closely with you on standardized date labeling, because we found that a lot of people, and myself included, are confused with date labels, and we don't understand what the difference is between sell-by date and best-by date, and that's why we are investing in that space as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the third thing we are doing is that we as a business can, of course, not talk about food waste if we're not sort of self-reflecting. So we are really working on walking the talk here, and very focused on our own business and factory waste, and understanding every aspect of our own procedures and policies so that we don't end up throwing food within our own systems. And the fourth thing we're doing is, because we are a big business, we have the responsibility to support the work that great nonprofits are doing, and so we are amplifying the work that everyone else is doing as well. So we really feel that there's a collective and a responsibility that we have with the broader sort of landscape to work and reduce food waste. So we're very focused on in-home food waste, but we're also focused on policy, and I'll of course talk about that in a bit as well.
Thank you. This is great. So getting into the meat, I'm going to pick up on some of the threads. So I actually wanted to first go to Claudia and see if you can, talk a little bit more about the federal interagency strategy that that you've been working on with USDA and FDA, and kind of more about what's included within that. And then we can get to like, how do we continue to build upon that? So that would be great.
Sure. So the federal interagency strategy, which came out about 2 years ago, is part of an initiative between EPA, USDA, and FDA to really collaborate on reducing food waste. So we built upon federal and non-federal analyses and calls to action that were already out there to help us prioritize areas that the three agencies could work on together and to focus on coordinating our efforts. So the actions include research, community investments, education and outreach, voluntary programs, public-private partnerships, tool development, technical assistance, event participation, policy discussions. And I'll just briefly mention each of the 6 priority areas. I won't get into too much detail, but just to give you an overview. So those include enhancing interagency coordination, increasing consumer education and outreach efforts, improving measurement, clarifying and communicating information on food safety, food date labels, and food donations, collaborating with private industry, and encouraging food waste reduction by federal agencies. I'd say with our new administration, we're really, we're taking a fresh look at our priorities. So there's definitely more to come on interagency work.
Great. And I think then, Yvette, so you mentioned there's this food loss and waste action plan, which in a lot of ways builds on what the agencies have been working on, but kind of pulls out some other priorities. And I know we saw a slide earlier, which I'm hoping that Sam can bring back up for us. And it would be great if you can talk through a little bit, what some of those ones are. We can chat about it a little bit.
Absolutely. There we go. There's the slide. So absolutely. So as I mentioned, the plan outlines 5 action areas, and you can see them listed out here. The first one is about investing in prevention and keeping food waste out of landfills. So food is the largest component of municipal waste sent to landfills and incinerators, where we know it produces methane and contributes to climate change. And on top of that, the nuisances that come along with throwing food waste in landfills, like toxic air pollution, disproportionately affect communities of color where landfills and incinerators are predominantly located. So we're calling for investment in not just compost infrastructure, but in programs that measure and prevent waste, incentivize rescue of surplus and safe excess food, and keep it out of landfills, really trying to kind of work our way higher up the hierarchy in the EPA food recovery hierarchy to really prevent that food from becoming waste in the first place, but then kind of effectively manage all of the different stages after that. And so we know that these investments will help achieve climate gains, improve our country's soils, boost profit for farmers, and feed more people. So one way to start doing this is by offering funding for states and cities that incentivizes organic waste measurement, rescue, recycling, and prevention. And the funding can support a range of activities, and we've outlined a few of them in the plan. Things like policy development or implementation of those policies, also to develop necessary infrastructure or expand or update current compost infrastructure. And we're also conscious of the fact that you can't manage what you don't measure. So we're asking cities and states to develop plans for food waste measurement and require that measurement. So today, state and city level waste characterization studies are conducted periodically, typically every 5 years, with few requirements for waste haulers and businesses to regularly report waste generation data publicly. And high quality organic waste measurement, rescue, recycling, and prevention plans by cities and states should include a strategy to aggregate, anonymize, and publicly report this data through centralized databases like ReFed and Insights engines, because we know that this reporting will kind of introduce much needed transparency and establish more timely monitoring of organic waste generation, which will enable us to kind of better manage our organic waste. So that's a kind of big piece of the first bucket here. And then the second one is really about enabling safe food donation. So in 2020, we know the sudden shift in food purchasing at the onset of COVID exposed the kind of inflexible and siloed nature of existing supply chains. When canceled contracts left surplus food stranded on American farms, even as demand at food banks and grocery stores left shelves empty. And while rescuing and redistributing surplus food is not a cure for hunger, it is an important stopgap in meeting immediate anti-hunger efforts. So we know that less than 10% of excess food is donated rather than wasted. And in the plan, we've suggested a few key action items, which include policy revisions like expanding the federal enhanced tax deduction for food donation to include nonprofit sales and transportation costs, because we all know food rescue isn't free. So these measures are really meant to support the organizations that are doing the work on the ground day in and day out on food rescue. We also suggest creating alternative markets for producers and consumers to more easily sell and buy good food that would otherwise go to waste. We also are really trying to kind of boost and strengthen regional supply chains, which could make it easier to close the gap between surplus food and need at a kind of regional level. And moving on, the third action area is about getting the US government and the administration to show leadership on food waste at home and abroad. And obviously we've heard already some of the really wonderful ways in which leadership has already been demonstrated. And we're hoping to continue that and kind of boost those efforts. And so it was mentioned that under the Obama administration, the federal government committed to the global goal of reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. And since that time, US businesses, consumers, communities, governments have taken important steps forward to voluntarily reduce food loss and waste, but we know more is needed. So in our plan, we call on the administration to embed this commitment to reducing food waste in the US's nationally determined contribution towards the Paris Climate Agreement, which would codify the importance of reducing food waste and reaching our climate goals. We also call on the government to lead by example by requiring federal facilities to measure, rescue, recycle, and prevent organic waste, and also to purchase finished compost products for use in or around the facilities. And we believe that if the federal government can do this, then so can everybody else. So we're really asking them to kind of put forth an example that others can follow. And the fourth is about educating and activating consumers. And we saw that wonderful Hellmann's video to start off with. And we know that consumers are by far the largest source of food waste in the US. Nearly 40% of US food waste is occurring in our homes. And recent polling confirms that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe food waste is a critical issue. Yet the amount of American household food waste generated per capita is not declining fast enough. And more must be done to educate consumers on the steps they can take to reduce their waste. NRDC's Save the Food campaign was developed with the sole purpose of raising awareness and educating consumers on how to waste less food at home. And with better research and more data on successful behavior change tactics, campaigns like Save the Food or other existing campaigns can help Americans make critical changes in the home to reduce food waste. So we're asking the federal government to continue to support this research and these kind of awareness raising campaigns. We're also asking them to support food waste reduction work in schools. A bill already exists to provide funding for schools to engage in food loss and waste efforts. And we really believe that it's important to kind of reach consumers, even in their early ages, for kind of long lasting change, and the opportunity to do so exists. And the final action area is around standardizing national date labeling. And Harvard has done a ton of work on this. So maybe Emily can share more later, but date label confusion is one of the leading causes of consumer food waste, estimated to drive nearly 85% of Americans to prematurely toss food that is still safe to eat. And lack of consistency in labels contributes to additional waste among grocery stores and other consumer-facing businesses, and unnecessarily restricts the safe donation of nutritious foods past their date labels to food rescue organizations. So our organizations have done a lot on this front already, but we will still need consistent labels, standardized at the federal level, and streamlined public education on how to use and interpret them. And until that happens, we'll be left with a hodgepodge of state requirements that confuse consumers and unnecessarily lead to waste. So this is a big area where we're asking for the federal government to kind of step in and provide more kind of awareness and standardization to kind of write this.
Thank you so much, Yvette. That was great. I mean, as you can tell, there's a lot in this plan and we can dig in more. I'm seeing also questions come into the Q&A and we'll get to those in about 15 minutes or so. So I want to dig in a couple of those places. I'm actually curious, Claudia, if you would be willing to say a little bit so one big thing in putting this plan together, and I think for those who are listening today, can be confusing, is around like, what can agencies do and what are things that EPA couldn't do without more support from Congress. And I wanted to see if you could share a little, just like almost a PSA about how attendees can really think about the role of agencies versus Congress in doing some of these things.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so sometimes we get that question of why is EPA even working on food waste? Like, where's our involvement there? So our role is defined by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Sorry, I'm going to get wonky for a second, or RCRA. And that lays out statutory obligations and expectations to provide data, information, guidelines, tools, technical assistance on resource conservation, recycling, recovery, and landfilling. And RCRA also specifically speaks to EPA providing states and local governments with technical assistance on solid waste management, resource recovery, and resource conservation. So in response to that, we design programs like the Sustainable Materials Management Program, where our food work is, to help increase capacity and give stakeholders tools to address those materials management issues, including reducing wasted food. On the other hand, Congress has the ability to pass new legislation that could direct federal agencies to undertake studies or initiatives. And every year through the appropriations process, Congress passes legislation that explicitly directs EPA on how to spend our money. And this is often accompanied by narratives that provide us with more detailed information. And Congress can also pass separate legislation directing federal agencies to take various actions related to food loss and waste. We can also in turn develop reports to Congress, which can include recommendations for congressional action. One more thing I'll mention is the GAO, which is an independent government agency, sort of like Congress's watchdog. And GAO often examines federal agency initiatives and makes recommendations for actions we should take. For example, recently the GAO issued a report entitled "Recycling, Building on Existing Federal Efforts Could Help Address Cross-Cutting Challenges." And that directs EPA to do many things, including studying the effect of existing public policies and the effective incentives and disincentives. And this will definitely include looking at food waste. So there's a lot going on. The relationship is, I don't want to say complicated, but we certainly have very different roles. And Emily, I know you and lots of other nonprofit partners have worked really hard on, working with Congress specifically to get food waste into legislation. So you're way more of an expert than I am in that department, but that's just a little bit about the different roles. And we don't always know necessarily what's coming from Congress either, so.
It's really helpful, and I think a good reminder to everyone really that, like, using your voice in both forums can be really helpful, because even like the interagency strategy doesn't technically have funding from Congress. So I know all the work that the agencies are doing has been like, because you guys have a real commitment to this, but that there's not been actual support and staff people. And I know that it can be hard for agencies when they hear a lot of push and it's like, we don't have the money to do any of these things. So that was really helpful. I think, obviously we're talking about policy. Priyanka, it's not often that you see a business out here saying, yes, we want to get involved in policy change. And in particular, I know one of the things you mentioned that Hellmann is working on is around date labeling, which I think one could argue, and I have argued, that it is beneficial to have more standards rather than having all the different state regulations, but it is asking for Congress to step in and require something that companies would do. Can you talk about why that's something that Hellmann is actually getting involved in, and what you want people to know about that?
Yeah, I can. So, just as Yvette said, and Claudia said, and you said, 40% of food is wasted at home. So, when we looked at sort of the role we can play, and, first of all, we examined, can we play a role? And we said, yes, as such a big brand, especially in the food space, we can play a role because we have sort of, as I said, we are in each, every other household in America. So that is very, very powerful. That is a lot of voices that can come together to talk and attack food waste. So we started the campaign on make taste not waste, which is, as I said, you open your fridge, what you find, you use it up. And the second piece we are working on, Emily, is on behavior change. So as Yvette was saying, it's really important to continuously have conversations with consumers to see how can we reduce food waste at home. So we actually just conducted a long study in Canada where we followed 1,000 families, and so gave them tips and tricks, and they were actually able to reduce in-home food waste by a third. So that pilot is just finished, and we're going to pilot in America as well, because we want to empower each and every person who buys Hellmann's, or whether you buy or it doesn't matter, that's irrelevant, but we want to make sure that you can reduce in-home food waste. But the reason we chose to support on policy is, as we were talking to consumers, many consumers said, we are confused. I will pick up a can of corn, or I'll pick up my milk, or I've frozen something like 2 years ago and I defrosted it and I don't know what to do with it now. And I looked at the label and I'm confused. And that's where it struck our team as we were doing what we do best as marketers, which is connect with consumers, that, if they're confused and it's the date label that's causing the confusion, well, we ought to reach out to Emily and talk about date labels and understand, and then sort of work with government to standardize date labels, because we can't afford that we are talking about in-home food waste, but not actually giving consumers every tool they need. And the policy is sort of that vehicle to remove consumer confusion. And that's why we've stepped in to support that space. And you'll be hearing more of us in the space of policy, particularly on standardized date labeling. Often I get the question of, why did you pick standardized date labeling versus any other policy? And really it was because if we can attack standardized date labeling, we'll remove that confusion and that other barrier that people have, and stop, prevent food waste. And our objective is to reduce food waste. So, once we're done with standardized date labeling, we will get to the next policy. We, can't possibly attack everything at once. But as we break it down, standardized date labeling is one that rose to the top of the policies that we must work on together with each and every one of you. So that's why we sort of honed in on that, and that's why we are making commitments in that space as well.
I'd actually love to ask you a follow-up, which is just about like how you see, other companies getting involved in this space, whether on the policy around date labels or in general. Like, do you see like movement in this direction, or what do you want other companies to know about what they could or should be doing?
Yeah, so I think each and every, particularly food brand, we have a responsibility in this space of food waste. We know at Unilever and on the Hellmann's team that we cannot do this on our own. So we need the collective of brands, we need the collective of nonprofits, as I said, as well as the government, both state and federal, to work together. So for me, the one thing that I keep coming back to is that if our consumers are confused and concerned, and they're wasting money, they're not able to be resourceful with what they have, it's our job as a brand to step up and be responsible. And so I'd encourage everybody who I speak with to, of course, research the space of food waste, because we spent almost 2.5 years just researching the space of food waste. We didn't just jump into it. We researched it, found where we can make an impact, and then aligned ourselves with that. And there are many other brands and many other retailers that are making a lot of headway in the space of food waste. And so we are working together constantly on signing letters, on working closely with you to be able to make that impact. But I think I've noticed in the last 1.5 years, especially during COVID, but even before COVID, that many food brands were becoming conscious of the fact that we need to take responsibility to impact food waste. And I see more of that in a very positive way coming together.
That's great. And I will say I've heard from some of the global work we're doing in particular, just a lot of companies that were hesitant to donate in the past, like just because of COVID and like seeing the need, it has been a real catalyst for change. So it seems like there's, going to be a lot of movement in that direction. On the topic of date labeling, I don't know, Yvette or Claudia, no need to respond more, but I don't know if either of you want to say anything else about that and why you think it is or is not a good area to focus or a tricky area to focus. That's to both of you. So either one of you can jump in. I know also like Claudia, it's sort of not really in EPA's wheelhouse necessarily. I don't know if you want to say anything about how you think about that issue, since it's something that's sort of at the fringe of what EPA can even really work on.
Sure. I mean, again, it's definitely not really central to EPA's role. It's definitely more with FDA and USDA to some extent. Personally, I'm extremely interested in anything we can do to help consumers waste less food. So I love that the conversation is going in this direction. That's where my passion lies. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there. We've already talked about consumers being responsible for 40% of municipal food waste. I think, though, that it's unfair to say that consumers are on their own, right? And date labeling is a perfect example of a confusing thing that drives food waste in the household level that we really have an opportunity. And there's other things like that. There's package sizing and package design. There's lots of things that are out of the consumer's hands that really have an influence on how much consumers are wasting at home. So I like seeing the energy around this. I would say that, EPA is definitely going to support, anything that we can do there. But it's not extremely central for EPA. It's definitely more of our federal partners who would be involved.
Yeah, and if I can just quickly chime in, I mean, I think not only is the kind of standardizing of the date labels necessary, but also I think as everyone's mentioning is really investing in that consumer education once we get standardized date labels, because I think that's kind of the problem we're facing right now, right? Like we're never educated on how to read a date label or the many other things that we see on food packages. And so even when we do make that change, which hopefully we do, there really does have to be a big effort by companies and by the government and by states, government at all levels to really explain to consumers what they're seeing, how it's different, and how they can kind of best manage their food afterwards.
All right, I'm going to go to a couple other questions, and then we'll start pulling in the questions from the Q&A. One, actually, back to you, Yvette, is really just on, you mentioned the work NRDC has done at the local level, and just if you can talk a little bit about how you see the local level kind of, innovations and barriers, et cetera, feeding into national goals and policies, and vice versa. Like, how do you guys think about that?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I really think it goes both ways. I think, states and cities have been making a lot of progress on food loss and waste on the policy front and in terms of implementation. And they're also the testing ground for solutions that can be scaled nationally. But in order to get there, strong federal support is required. And many of those solutions that are being tested at the local level are reflected in the action plan that we chatted about. So we're really calling on the government to kind of, and they've already done so in many ways, kind of recognize what states and cities are doing and help support the kind of scaling of that. So in 2019, for example, New York State passed the Food Donation and Food Scrap Recycling Act, which we might all know because we're on the New York City Food Waste Fair call, but it requires the largest generators of food waste across the state to separate excess wholesome food for donation and recycle any remaining food scraps. And policies like this one, which are also found in other states like California, Massachusetts, and Vermont, can help prevent food waste, rescue surplus food for those in need, and produce compost to regenerate our soils, all the while kind of creating jobs. And with more federal support and incentives, we can scale these practices and lessons learned from the states that are trying these policy interventions already to states and municipalities across the US who are maybe kind of not here that yet there. And another example is this kind of notion of leading by example. One of the things that we call for in the plan, as I mentioned earlier, is to kind of show leadership on the issue of food waste at home and abroad. And the cities that NRDC is working with through our Food Matters project really have made wonderful strides on this front. So part of the kind of, or a piece of the strategies that they've rolled out is around kind of proclamations and public commitments to food waste. So just in the past couple of months, actually, we've had 4 mayoral proclamations issued to kind of commit the cities to work on food waste. And we really think that this kind of sets the tone for action on food waste at the local level and kind of publicly commits the local government to continued and sustained action on that front. So in the kind of mirroring that in the food loss and waste action plan, we've both asked the federal government to do this in their food facilities and kind of show other facilities how it can be done. But as I also mentioned, to kind of adopting our food loss and waste goals into the US's nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. So we really think that, you know, if their federal government is able to do these things, it'll send a clear market signal to states, cities, companies, and other countries to similarly kind of make food loss and waste reduction an official part of their climate strategies and their overall goals. And it'll also help to kind of reestablish the US as a climate leader.
All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start pulling in some of the questions from this Q&A that we have because we have good questions. I have like a couple that I didn't get to, but I will make sure that we come back to them. One actually, Yvette, just based on what you were just saying, one of the questions from the Q&A was just about the food donation requirements in NYC. So you mentioned the New York State law. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say in response to that question specifically.
I don't actually know the food donation requirements offhand. I know that like we're very much in the kind of rolling out phase of this policy. So I'm not sure if maybe we can drop some links into the chat with the specific requirements, or if anyone else on the panel knows the specifics, feel free to come in.
So another question that I think also picks up on where we were just talking about some of the you know, state and local side. And I'm wondering if Claudia can get started on answering this. The question is really about how cooperative have state and federal representatives been in supporting these goals. And I think maybe it's also, you can talk about the role the EPA plays in working with state and local counterparts.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think there's a wide variety of where states and cities are at. I mean, we have some states and cities that have made incredible progress. NRDC's Food Matters network of cities are some really great examples of cities really tackling these issues from a lot of different perspectives and focusing on different parts of the food supply chain and different efforts. In terms of EPA's role, I mean, we definitely have a role there. In our regional offices, especially, we have 10 regional offices across the country, and they really work on the ground with state and municipal governments, nonprofits, food businesses, academia, food policy councils, and other groups, really convening, facilitating, providing training, and sharing resources. I think that's, you know, one role that EPA really has is helping to form these coalitions and jumpstarting collaboration. I've seen examples in our regions of, you know, regional food systems that are just starting to think about food waste, and EPA tries to come in and really bring all the players at the table. And sometimes we bring in players like the Department of Health that weren't even necessarily on the short list of people that, you know, they thought needed to be involved. And that can often get, you know, get these regional food systems and these different stakeholders and partners to set their own goals in line with our domestic goal and really try and make food waste part of their climate plan. And that gets it sort of, it gets it attention and it gets it some solid funding. and really making it a priority among so many other priorities. But really, we know that so many of these areas have really limited resources and a lot of competing priorities. And so often there's really no need to reinvent the wheel, and peer learning can really have a huge impact. I know that's something that NRDC focuses on as well with the Food Matters cities, but there's so many lessons learned and experiences and approaches that have worked. There's also ones that haven't necessarily worked, and it's really important to share those learnings with others who are getting started. So EPA definitely has a role in facilitating those conversations and sharing that information across the country.
There's a question here. I'm trying to mix it up on our panel, so I'm kind of jumping around. But Priyanka, that was really about some of the any like changes in packaging or things like that. So if you can dig in a little to things that Hellmann's doing, really thinking about driving more change in the consumer households.
Yes, so we've taken the agenda, it's all about make, taste, not waste. So the first thing we actually did before we even jumped into food waste was on plastic waste, because that is also something that we need to consider as being another brand. So we now use all post-consumer recycled material on the plastics that we use. When it came to food waste, what we are doing first, as I said, walking the talk is super important to us. So we have started looking at how much food gets left behind in our own packaging. So whether you use our jars or you use our squeeze, what is the leave behind? So it's getting a little technical, but we actually spend a lot of time, myself and our broader team, looking at, once you use the jar, once you use the squeeze bottle, how much food is left behind, and how do we make sure that we are not having so much leave behind? So there is a lot of investment that we are making, the Hellmann's team is making, as well as the broader Unilever community is making, to really understand packaging and use the best type of packaging, as well as easy out technology, which we have, which is a little sort of nerdy, but to make sure that we use the best technologies to prevent that food waste. We are also doing the same thing, as I said earlier, in our processes to make sure that when in our factories, in our distribution centers, we are preventing as much waste as possible. So I know that there are a lot of work happening within the company, within our brand, of course, and the broader CPG industry as well, looking at what is this leave behind that happens and how can we prevent that as well. So I think that in the next 2 years or so, we'll see a lot of improvement in packaging, very focused on preventing food waste. So that's definitely a stream of work that's happening.
Great. All right, I'm trying to group a couple questions together here that we got on composting. So I think some of them are really about, making sure more things are like compostable, whether that's in the packaging realm. And then it's mentioned, one of the questions was really about the USDA climate smart ag policy that doesn't provide incentives for composting specifically. So I know, we don't have a USDA rep here, but I don't know, Claudia, if you can say anything about things EPA is doing to really try to support, and encourage composting. So sort of can jump around a little bit, but there's clearly a lot of folks here who are curious about where composting is headed, both on the packaging side and then in the policy side. Anyone want to kick it off?
I mean, I'm happy to just jump in and say, I think on what's needed, I mean, we are constantly asked if there's funding available to help composting infrastructure, both large scale and small scale. I would say we've been able to fund some projects through some regional grants, but there's a lot more needed there. USDA is in its second year of under their urban ag office. They have a funding opportunity that I believe is open right now for community composting and food waste reduction projects. So definitely check that out. But that's definitely an area where we know there's more needed, and we're hoping we can be able to help in that area soon.
Priyanka, go ahead.
Yeah, I can chime in too. I was saying that we made a choice, Emily, at this point that we are going to focus on the prevention of food waste first, so sort of a little bit more upstream, and that's also where we find the largest impact to be when we look at in-home food waste. But sort of as we proceed and we build out the full strategy, we will come to the space of composting as well, because we know that there's all sorts of people. There's some who are not even aware that food waste is happening in their own homes. And then there's some who are obviously very, very engaged with the issue of food waste. And so eventually we are going to get to tackling composting as well. But at the moment, Hellmann's is very focused on the prevention aspect of food waste.
I was just going to say that I think that not just the kind of on the kind of handling side of compost is important. Like we absolutely need infrastructure development at all levels, very local infrastructure, but also large scale. And we need kind of support to do that. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we kind of build demand for compost so that, you know, when we are actually successful in generating compost, that it has somewhere to go and it can actually serve its purpose, which is regenerating healthy soils. And so we do have, you know, some calls to action in the action plan, just to plug that again. And, you know, one of them includes kind of expanding the definition of compost so that it kind of can appeal to, or is kind of more easily accessible to other stakeholders like farmers, for example. So it absolutely is a priority. And I think we're simultaneously trying to work on the kind of processing side, but also the demand side.
That makes sense. And there was actually a question that came in also about procurement in general. I think the question was framed more as being procurement for in any ways that could, let me see exactly what it said. Does the action plan encourage federal government procurement of products that incorporate food waste or use best practices to mitigate wastage? So you sort of answered it from the compost perspective, which is like creating demand for this product. I don't know if there's anything that, you know, any of you can think of on the procurement side that would also create more demand for products that would reduce food waste. Kind of looking to Yvette, maybe if you want to go first, or Claudia, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think this kind of falls nicely in line with some of the kind of lead by example things that we've been mentioning. I think that obviously the federal government is a huge procurer of food products. And so there is a great opportunity to kind of better use that purchasing power to make sure that they're kind of procuring food that is in line with our kind of climate values and climate practices. And so I know that there have been a lot of efforts kind of on different levels of government and also at the federal level. And so while we don't call for any specific procurement practices in the action plan, I know that there are some kind of rumblings of policies that are happening, and it is procurement in general, I think, is becoming more of a hot topic. And I think that there will hopefully be some opportunities coming down the pipeline soon.
Okay, so I'm going to continue through some of these questions, but I'm going to move back to a couple that I want to ask that are sort of forward looking. So maybe one to start from Claudia's end would be, you know, I know we're in the beginning of a new administration. You can't speak that much about EPA's kind of forward-looking plans, but anything you can share with what you think might be coming down the pike in terms of either the EPA side or the interagency strategy that people should have on their radar?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the administration is still coming up to speed, but we know obviously that climate change is a top priority, which is wonderful. And we want to focus on policies and actions that will help address climate change by reducing GHG emissions in this space. So we're really trying to focus on where we can get the most bang for our buck there. To that end, and thinking about setting targets and goals, kind of coming back to that, we're exploring how to better align our domestic 2030 goal to cut food waste by 50% with the International Sustainable Development Goal target 12.3. And by aligning our goal with the international SDG target, the US would be encouraging actions and investment in the prevention of food waste and keeping food in the human supply chain, instead of just focusing on diverting it from landfills and incinerators. And this would really drive more significant reductions in GHG emissions. So I think there's more to come there, but I think the bottom line is that the best thing we can do to have an impact on climate change is really prevention. And we know there's always going to be unpreventable food scraps. And of course, we want to encourage composting and anaerobic digestion for those, but really we want to focus on the prevention aspect of it. in terms of the short term, just some other things I wanted to mention that will be coming out from EPA. We're publishing a series of reports that synthesize the latest science on food waste. So look for that series. And those are really going to help everybody focus on the scientific basis for why and how we should be working on food waste. So it's going to also provide a comprehensive look at the environmental impacts of wasted food from production to management and disposal, including life cycle analyses of all the various ways that we can manage food waste. It's also going to focus on the environmental benefits, of course, of cutting food waste in half. So this should help build the scientific basis for policymaking and private sector investments. And the first set of those papers should be coming out this summer with more later this year. So I think in addition to that, really building that scientific basis, making sure what we're doing and pushing policy that really addresses climate change. I think we're also really hopeful that we'll be able to work on some of the important priorities that have been laid out in the food waste action plan that we've been talking about today. And hopefully we'll be able to announce some funding opportunities later this year as well. So definitely stay tuned. We're still somewhat in the early days of the administration, although it doesn't necessarily feel that way. But yeah, definitely more to come. I'm really excited.
That's great. And I think I should put a really quick plug at that point too for our missing panelist, Dana Gunders from ReFed, who couldn't join. And I know there's also really good data on ReFed's Insight Engine, which launched this year and has lots of really cool ways you can manipulate data. So I know, Claudia, you said new data is coming, which is really exciting. In the meantime, people should check that out. I'm going to give a quick last question both to Yvette and Priyanka. First, Yvette, very briefly, what is the next step for the action plan? Like, what do you see as legislative vehicles that are coming that people should have on their radar?
Absolutely. There are a lot in the works already. And so, you know, we're looking at the infrastructure package that is, you know, right around the corner. We're also looking at the Childhood Reauthorization Act or Nutrition Reauthorization Act, and a couple of other kind of policy areas. And we're also, I will just say, NRDC is doing a lot of work on the state policy front and are hoping to kind of share more information soon on that. And the last thing is that I would just like to plug, I know we have a ton of kind of nonprofit organizations and other stakeholders and companies on this call. One way to kind of get involved is to sign on to the Food Loss and Waste Action Plan. There is a form that you can fill out on the website to sign on. And I think the, you know, broad support is what we need to kind of encourage action and get support that we need on this. So please sign on.
Thank you. That's amazing. So we'll rechat the link. And Priyanka, I'm going to close with you. And I would love, like, you've been so thoughtful about really what is the role of all the different sectors. What's the final kind of call to action that you want to share with listeners today as to what you think, you know, how they should think about this?
Yeah, I can't stop saying this, but just make taste and not waste. So, you know, for us, I find that as we research the space, we found that every individual can make a difference. And just thinking about the fact, I know we've said it so many times now that 40% of food waste is happening in your homes. Each one of us can make an impact. So yes, of course, we need all the stakeholders to come together. We need the government to help us standardize data label, but it doesn't happen in sort of if we don't raise our voices. So I feel like each one of us individually comes together, we do our role, and then sort of we come together to make you know, a large impact happen. So I'm really hopeful that by raising just awareness of this fact that food waste can be impacted and each one of us can be more resourceful with our food, we will be able to see an impact soon, and then continue that journey to making more and more impact, and one day, you know, getting rid of this problem of food waste that we have here.
You all are so amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. They were really good. So we'll see if we can send follow-ups and answer any of them. Thank you again. Thanks for the organizers of the New York City Food Waste Fair.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.